Welcome to the third episode in this series on Pride Month. What I have to say in the first part of this episode will be one of the most important parts in the entire series, so I'm hoping you'll stick around for it. In the last episode, I explained why pride culture is not an irreversible development. It can be overturned. But that implies nothing about whether it will be, or whether it should be. Yet these two issues are linked. As long as the majority of people believe that pride should not be overturned, then we can safely infer that it won't be. But notice that qualification, as long as. Do we have any reason to think this favorable environment might not last? I actually think we do, at least in some places in the West. I believe we've reached a point in Western culture that can be likened to a sort of three-way showdown. To simplify, there are basically three mutually exclusive worldviews competing for control of the West right now: secularism, traditional Christianity, and traditional Islam. As it relates to the topic of pride, we could think of this as a conflict between the rainbow, the cross, and the crescent. Though many liberal churches fly the rainbow flag, the rainbow, in its current use as a symbol of pride, is a symbol of revolt against a traditional religious order. It is therefore a secular symbol. You need to understand that pride arose in a very specific historical context. It did not develop in China, or India, or Africa, or any other non-Western country. It formed in the uniquely secular culture of the West. The basic reason is pretty straightforward. The secular worldview is the most libertine on offer. Its moral permissiveness is unrivaled by the other philosophical and religious traditions. The intellectual architects of the sexual revolution knew this full well. A disproportionate number of them were atheists and secular agnostics. The rest were Unitarians and theological liberals. In any case, all thought leaders of the sexual revolution were rapid opponents of traditional Christianity, which was the sole barrier to sexual liberation. But here's something really crazy. It's something that perhaps many of you listening right now have never heard, something which, if true, would revolutionize the way you think about this entire debate. My argument is that atheism was a necessary condition for the sexual revolution, but it was nowhere near sufficient to generate our current pride culture. Pride needed the additional support of Christianity itself, its mortal enemy. I'm currently working on a full-length book defending this thesis. The Pride Revolution piggybacked on the civil rights movement of the 60s. Without the civil rights movement, you don't get pride. And there's no way that atheism by itself would give you the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was made possible by America's Christian heritage. If you don't believe me, just start by reading Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. As an aside, I'll ignore for now the extent to which the civil rights movement was shaped more by mainline liberal Christianity rather than by conservative evangelical Christianity. The point is that it's unintelligible without the broadly Christian background that made it possible. This means that the Pride movement was parasitical on Christian moral intuitions and political institutions. There's no way pride could have originated in the ancient world, whether it be the ancient Near East or even pagan Greece and Rome. Pride relied on borrowed capital from the Christian moral worldview. Let me just give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. Christianity teaches that all human beings are created equal in the sense that all of them bear God's image, and that all humans, therefore, are sacred, such that each of us must treat everyone else with equal respect. Christian philosophers in the Middle Ages and the Reformation turned this into a robust political theory of God-given natural rights, along with the ideas of natural liberty and equality. The United States was 98% Protestant when the Constitution was written. All the state constitutions required subscription to Orthodox Christianity in order to hold political office. For those with eyes to see, the Bill of Rights is a Christianized religious document. The U.S. became the land of opportunity because it was first and foremost the land of Christianity. It was the land of liberty because it, unlike most countries in the world, was governed by constitutionally guaranteed rights. What many modern Americans don't realize, though, is that these rights were the product of hundreds of years of Christian political theology. Even the 14th Amendment, which is the basis of all civil rights legislation, was the result of Christianized political intuitions. In fact, the 14th Amendment, with its Equal Protection Clause, is arguably just making explicit what was already entailed in the earlier amendments. The idea that all should enjoy equal rights of protection would have made no sense in the pre-Christian world of the ancient Egyptians, say. They would have found it unintelligible. The Greeks and the Romans would have laughed at it. Now, it's the same 14th Amendment, though, that was eventually used to protect the LGBTQ. Due to liberal judicial activists on the Supreme Court, the Equal Protection Clause was reinterpreted to cover gays. But all of this would have been unthinkable by the Founding Fathers, or any other American until the mid-20th century or so. They would have never said that you have a constitutional right to commit such flagrant moral wrongs. So how did Americans reach the point of thinking that made sense? Well, this is where secularism comes in. Secular philosophers gradually modified the traditional Christian theory of rights by detaching it from Christianity and by emptying it of its Christian meaning. Those secular intellectuals rid themselves of God, they did not rid themselves of their Christianized moral and political intuitions. They continue to believe that all people have fundamental rights and that all are equal in at least that one crucial respect. But, and here's the point, instead of talking about these rights as given to us by God, or instead of grounding these rights in the fact that we're made in God's image, secularists switch to the liberalizing language that we are familiar with today, the language of inherent dignity, of inherent worth, and of human rights. It is astonishing to me how many secular Americans use this language without having the slightest idea of where it came from or whether it makes sense or how to go about proving it. It reminds me of the old Roadrunner cartoons where Wile E. Coyote goes flying off the cliff and stands in thin air. Secular Americans are like that. They're standing on philosophical thin air. Like Wile E. Coyote, they will remain confident only as long as they do not look down to see that there's nothing underneath them. What you need to know is that none of those lofty ideals of inherent dignity and worth and human rights make any sense within a consistently secular perspective. It was only because secular Americans were preconditioned by Christian moral thought that they found those ideals plausible. This means, paradoxically, that the Pride Revolution, which is antithetical to Christianity, was thoroughly dependent upon it. Have you ever watched one of those documentaries about parasitic wasps? These clever little creatures reproduce themselves by injecting their larvae into caterpillars, whose bodies then serve as the host for the development of the baby wasps. The Pride movement is like that. It was conceived by the wasp of atheism and nurtured within the caterpillar of Christianity. Atheism is its genetic mother, but it could never have developed without its Christian host. Pride could not have originated from atheism alone, and it certainly would not have arisen from Christianity alone. It required both. And this is what makes the Pride movement deeply syncretistic. It's dependent upon two totally incompatible perspectives on life. Atheism and Christianity are contradictory worldviews. They have radically different conceptions of what it means to be human, of human origins, nature, purpose, and destiny. And insofar as both sides are consistent with their basic presuppositions, they will have contradictory moral views as well. And that is one of Pride's fatal flaws. It is incoherent. To defend itself, it must move back and forth conceptually between atheistic morality on the one hand and Christian morality on the other. As long as we think that gays and lesbians and trans people have inherent dignity and worth and universal rights and all that, we're still operating on Christian borrowed capital, because there's no logical room for those ideals within a consistently atheistic or secular perspective on life. And this is the first reason why I think that the future of Pride is in jeopardy. The more Western culture moves away from its Christian heritage, the less people will believe in inherent dignity and worth and human rights. All those concepts are basically free-floating in philosophical thin air right now. They have no rational grounding. So if enough people in the West become self-consistently secular, they might repudiate those ideals altogether, the ideals that Pride thrives upon. We might see instead a revival of ancient paganism. This would result in the West becoming more comfortable with the pagan pre-Christian belief in inequality. But there are two other threats to the future of Pride in the West. One is the mass immigration of traditional Muslims into the West. The other is the revival of traditional Christianity in the West. Let me first define what I mean by those terms. It's very important that we distinguish traditional Islam and Christianity from the secularized versions that we find in the modern West today. Much of what passes for Christianity, for example, would be unrecognizable to Christians of the past. It's really just a different religion. It's basically secular humanism slathered in Jesus sauce. In a similar but far less pronounced way, plenty of Muslims in the West have been secularized. They are nominal Muslims, just like their nominal Christian neighbors. Really, both are just secularists who identify with their respective religions because of family or ethnicity or regional background. Many of these self-professing Muslims and Christians are essentially ignorant of what their historic religions traditionally taught. If they spent the time to inform themselves, they would undoubtedly disassociate themselves from those religions and probably openly identify as agnostic or atheist or as spiritual but not religious. Now, with that clarification out of the way, let's turn to traditional Islam. A good place to start is by checking any of the major LGBTQ watchdog organizations and what they have to say about the status of Pride across the globe. For example, the Human Rights Campaign website says this: today, 63 countries continue to criminalize consensual same-sex acts, and 12 of these countries have jurisdictions in which same-sex relations are punishable by death. Many more countries continue to be dangerous and even deadly, for LGBTQI plus people, even after the implementation of protective laws, end quote. Now, if you go on to identify which countries they're talking about, you'll find they are overwhelmingly Muslim countries from the Middle East and from Africa. And these are precisely the people who are flooding into Western Europe right now, as I'll explain in a minute. You can also visit the ILGA database online. ILGA is an acronym. It stands for International Lesbian and Gay Association. The website provides a comprehensive account of the status of SOGI laws across the world. The acronym SOGI stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. The ILGA website has world maps that represent the legal status of LGBTQ people across the world. One of the maps is called, quote, Criminalization of Consensual Same-Sex Sexual Acts, end quote. It's color-coded into 6 colors. White means no criminalization. Most of the world is currently white. The remaining 5 colors, from light beige to dark brown, represent an increasing degree of severity in the anti-pride laws. In order of severity, these colors refer to 1. De facto criminalization, 2. Up to 8 years imprisonment, 3. 10 years to life in prison, 4. Possible death penalty, and 5. Death penalty pretty much guaranteed. One glance at this map shows you exactly where these countries are: the Muslim Middle East and the Muslim African countries. And here's the thing. These are exactly the locations from which most of the immigrants into Western Europe are coming. The average number of African and Middle Eastern Muslims entering Western Europe annually is between 500,000 and 1 million. Bear in mind that Western European countries are relatively small. A huge portion of Europe could fit into the state of Texas. Smaller European states cannot absorb this many Muslim immigrants without undergoing a massive democratic and cultural shift. Sweden is projected to have 20 to 30% Muslim population by 2050. These high rates of immigration are only part of the equation. There is also the matter of reproductive rates. There's a massive difference in the number of kids that secular Europeans have versus traditional Muslims from these countries. The average non-Muslim woman in France has 1.8 kids. The average non-Muslim woman in the UK has 1.4. But if you scan the statistics of Middle Eastern Muslim women and African Muslim women, the averages jump to anywhere from 5 to 8 kids. Why are reproductive rates so low among Western European women? Their desire to leave a smaller carbon footprint goes only so far. A better explanation is their secular worldview, which encourages a more hedonistic and individualistic lifestyle. Having lots of kids just gets in the way of that. Feminism is really just a specific version of that philosophy. It's one custom-tailored to women as a class. By elevating careerism over domesticity, it encourages the postponement of marriage and the postponement of children, hence the need for the pill and abortion on demand. Islam, in contrast, rejects those secular priorities. It is the most anti-feminist religion on the planet. Muslim women are trained to be mothers, to marry early, to have many children, and to reject birth control and abortion. Moreover, Muslim women live in the most patriarchal culture on the planet. They do what their husbands tell them. This is mostly because they believe they have a religious duty to do so, but it's partly because the Quran itself permits their husbands to beat unruly wives. Furthermore, many Muslim men from the Middle East and Africa practice polygamy, which obviously boosts reproduction rates all the more. You don't need to be a genius to think through the consequences of these two radically different cultures living side by side within the same borders. If one group is having 1 to 2 kids and the other is having 4 to 6 kids, say, the latter will eventually become the majority. But what do the polls say about Muslim birth rates in Western Europe? Skeptics note that the numbers are much lower than the ones coming out of the Middle East and Africa. In France and the UK, the average Muslim woman has 2.9 children, compared to the non-Muslim French women at 1.8 and the non-Muslim British woman at 1.4. That's still a significant discrepancy, of course, but it's nothing compared to what I noted earlier. So I want to add a quick word here about statistics regarding Muslims in Western Europe. There's a big difference between the massive wave of first-generation Muslim immigrants that I'm talking about right now versus, say, the second, third, or fourth-generation Muslims in the West, many of whom were long ago assimilated into Western culture. If you survey younger Muslims in Western Europe who are second or third generation, they will be less progressive than their secular peers, of course, but more progressive than the first-generation immigrants I'm talking about. This means that when you look at polls about Western European Muslims, they often don't tell you if they're polling the more westernized Muslims or the more traditional Muslims, many of whom, by the way, are not polled due to linguistic and cultural barriers. So it's possible that the number of 2.9 is skewed toward the more assimilated westernized second and third generation Muslims rather than the newly arriving mass of immigrants whose reproductive rates are far, far higher. Some might object that none of this really matters since European governments are still functionally secular in their legal systems. so the LGBTQ people are still protected. But that response completely misses the point. The point is that shifting demographics could change that. Bear in mind that these are democratic countries we're talking about. All that's necessary to change their laws and their policies is to change the core values of the voters and politicians, which is what Islamification would do. One obvious way of trying to prevent this is for Europeans to convert Muslims to the secular worldview. But that's exactly what will not happen. To the contrary, African and Middle Eastern Muslim immigrants are profoundly convinced of traditional Islam. They are trying to convert the already dwindling population of secular Europeans to Islam. It's no secret because many European imams openly say this. The question is whether progressives in the West will take them at their word. I recently watched a Netflix documentary on the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. One of the scholars confided that if there is anything that Hitler is to be commended for, it's his honesty in telling the world ahead of time what he wanted to do. But too few people actually believed him. I wonder if this is happening to Europe again, though now in connection with a different worldview. The imams and immigrants are openly saying they mean to convert their host cultures to Sharia law. And yet progressive Europeans struggle to take this seriously. Many are terrified of sounding like Islamophobes. Some imams admit openly that they're taking advantage of this fact. As long as secular Europeans are afraid of sounding like Islamophobes, the traditional Muslim immigrants become all the more empowered to build their Sharia-controlled enclaves. But if you're still not convinced, go research the reaction of non-progressive Europeans. There's been a massive awakening all across Western Europe to the growing cultural conflict. We're witnessing the merging of two radically different rivers of civilization, one of which is pro-feminist and pro-pride, and the other is not. These two cultures cannot and will not coexist. The best proof of this is France, which has historically been the most secular country in all of Europe. Back in the day, the French tried to be good secularists by allowing for robust religious tolerance. The result, though, was an enormous influx of Muslims into the country. The French populace is now 10 to 15% Muslim. Predictably, this has led to a cultural clash. So what has the French government done? They basically set aside their secular belief in tolerance and diversity and began to suppress the open expression of traditional Islam. As things currently stand, you basically have two radically different cultures living side by side. I suspect that future civil conflict is inevitable. Significantly, some of the loudest anti-Muslim voices in Western Europe are coming from the feminists and the pride community, who are beginning to realize what this could mean for their future. They're literally the ones most at risk. So my first contention is that the pride movement could well be overturned by Islam. But there's arguably even a greater threat to the future of pride in the West. I'm talking about the revival of traditional Christianity. And since this is a complex topic, I'm going to reserve that for the next episode.